Good evening, everyone. I'm Jane, and thank you for joining us again in person and online for our lucky last Friday evening meeting for this year. This evening, we're delighted to welcome our very own Eve Warren and Diana, Eve's daughter. Eve sees her novel, A Dream in a Teacup, as a self-portrayal of her life, but it's also a glimpse into Canberra's psyche during the 1940s. Eve Warren has been a member of the Canberra Jung Society for 30 years. She has a BA in Social Welfare from Charles Sturt University and a Master's in Theology, Ageing and Pastoral Care from the Australian Catholic University. Eve has worked with the ageing people with dementia and their carers, tapping into mediums such as the labyrinth, music, dance, drawing, play work, and dreams to explore wisdom, intuition, and inner strength. Eve is selling her books this evening for $20 and has generously undertaken to donate the proceeds to our Christmas party here on Saturday the 5th of December. Thank you, Eve. Eve will talk for almost an hour, then we'll break for 15 minutes for tea and coffee, then resume with questions and discussion and finish by 10 p.m. If you don't want to be photographed, please sit away from the Zoom. Next, we're recording this session, so if you're here online, please remain muted while Eve is speaking to avoid background noise. You can always make comments using the Zoom chat button. So thank you very much. Eve, would you like to have Eve coming over here and starting out? Thank you very much, Eve, Jean, for coming along. So I'm just wondering, can you hear me or do I need to use the microphone? Yes or no? Okay, well, we'll see. I'm a little bit croaky, so I hope I don't sort of disappear on you. Okay, so you can see, I read somewhere that well-written fiction should contain in good dose aspects of both body and soul. Why? Well, because a good story should just as much be about the battle going on within the author's inner demons as it is about human injustice outside and within the world at large. And it should, in some way, guide the reader and the author towards a more fulfilling life. Really good stories are the ones that draw upon the power of the eternal question. Good evening, everyone. It's been 2 years since I launched this book, the novel, and it's a story that for so long and for so many reasons demanded to be told. Interestingly, and according to the opinion of some of my readers, this book, I've been told that it would work really well as a play, which figures because when I've been asked to describe how I went about selecting my characters, I've said it wasn't that different to the way my unconscious self, sometimes in dreams, goes about casting the characters needed in order to represent the different aspects of myself. Just trying to get the light right. Overhead down. Yeah. So there you see Bridget about waiting to go into the church, St. Christopher's church, that is, at 9 o'clock to get married. Now, I know some of you have read the book and others have taken the time to read chapter 1. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, allow me to read a little of the synopsis for you. As the train pulled out of Central Station, anxious and bewildered Bridget Mary O'Brien sat staring out the window as the train wrenched her away from the sanctuary of the cloistered life she had lived for almost 7 years. In Canberra, worldly and shameless, the Cardinal Dougal Alexander McGregor, widower and negligent father, was actively seeking a wife to help him make a home for his 4 children. The Dream in a Teacup is set in Westlake, a Canberra workman's settlement in 1949. Bridget shares her life and that of her closest female friends through her journal and nighttime dreams. Join these remarkable women on a pilgrimage of self-discovery, laugh and cry with them in their daily struggle to make sense of their lives in what was very much a patriarchal society, a time when women were brainwashed into narrowly defined roles and handed by the constraints of men in power, politics, and the church. And then rejoice with Bridget when it appears she has indeed managed to create her own heavenly place. So have you pegged the protagonist? I'm sure you have. It's Bridget, the introspective and contemplative ex-nun, the chaste and virginal maiden who, as the synopsis alludes, is about to embark on a journey of self, which culminates in her both reclaiming and embracing the God-given gifts she has for so long fought to renounce, under the deluded belief that they were not of God, but sinful and pagan. And the antagonist in this drama? Yes, it's our Dougal, a definitive male image depicting no particular man and fundamentally unconscious. He's also one of the 2 least introspective characters. Dougal has been searching the dance halls in and around Canberra for over 2 years, optimistically expecting to meet that good woman for whom he hoped would help make a home for him and his motherless children. Not an easy task, considering suitable single women were as scarce as hen's teeth in Canberra at that time. But it was only after one of those shiny bumps from the Department of Housing informed him of his position on the waiting list and that it was reasonable for him to expect an offer within 6 months, that he threw fate to the wind and called on a higher power for assistance. In fact, it was the very next Saturday after he had the conversation with the bloke from Housing that Lady Luck came to his assistance, and boy oh boy did she come up trumps. Look, it's probably better if I give you Dougal's account of what happened next. You know, just from the first moment I set eyes on her, I knew she wasn't at all my usual type. And once she opened her blooming mouth, I was damn sure of it. But none of that was going to put me off. No fear it wasn't. Then when Aunt Jan introduced me as her late sister's husband and the father of 4 little kids, I thought it was all over red yoga. But no blooming fear. If anything, it seemed to buck up her interest in me. And just one more snippet from the horse's mouth, so to speak. The way I figured it, for a bloke like me, the chances of meeting someone like her was as slim as the horse I just backed big bickies on, landing the good alley at the starting gates. I'm telling you, I would have backed London to a brick, because it was like something in the waters telling me under no circumstances was I to let that little filly out of my sight. So what role do you think Dougal played in my journey towards wholeness?
Well, a friend close enough to dig with me recently asked me the same question, and after giving it some thought, I answered. Well, firstly, his character represents the masculine figure in my feminine psychology and plays the role between my conscious and unconscious self. And I guess, in essence, according to Jung, the animus is an archetype. And archetypes are like innate behavioural patterns, fundamentally unconscious, and the hereditary factor of a primordial image, origin. Jung might also add the animus or anima is an imprint or archetype of all the ancestral experiences of man. For me personally, well, I believe on a collective unconscious level that the animus is a psychic structure found within all women and represents a small but vital aspect of the male. Okay, so from the little you know about Bridget and Dougal, it's obvious that these two characters have been cast in distinct opposites in personality. In Jungian terms, the introvert and the extrovert. Terms that, in my opinion, have become a bit distorted and new agey. But I found a very simple explanation for my two main characters. Bridget is shy in relation to the outer world, and Dougal is shy in relation to the inner world. Everyone in agreement so far? Well, then let's get on with the story. Once upon a time, there was a rather devout and reverent young woman named Bridget, who after many months of prayer and contemplation made the decision to leave the sanctuary of the Benedictine order of nuns and come out from behind the convent walls. This decision was by no means impulsive, nor was it made lightly. As well as that, Bridget's unfaltering trust in God had led her to believe that her next vocation in life would somehow involve the taking care of children. In her imaginings, she saw herself rescuing children from the slums of city streets or working out on a remote outback station mission or something along those lines that would still enable her, while no longer being technically a bride of Christ anymore, but at least still be having God's will foremost in her heart and mind. And so on that Saturday morning that Dougal has already detailed, when he was introduced to her as a widower with 4 young children, well, the dear sweet innocent read the occurrence as the sign she had been waiting for, ordained by God and written as destiny. I'm thinking, in order to be fair to Bridget, an explanation needs to be made as to why the dear sweet innocent thing thought she could move into this new vocation, i.e. taking care of Dougal's children, and still retain some kind of version of her former self and remain somehow a bride of Christ. You see, because she had been heavily indoctrinated into believing it was a sin to as much as imagine the goings-on between marital sheets, other than for the procreation of children, for which she innocently figured Dougal already had 4 and probably wouldn't want more, would he? Yes, I know, it beggars belief. And thus it came to pass that after 6 short months of careful wooing, with kid gloves on, so to speak, and as is written at the end of the chapter 1, Mr. and Mrs. Dougal McGregor were cloistered inside the cottage of number 65 Westlake for the duration of the coldest pink birthday long weekend on record. For Dougal, the weekend was like winning the trifecta. Sure, he'd had to put in an enormous amount of effort into wooing and courting her over the past 6 months, but it had paid off big time. Lady luck had sure as hell come through for him this time. But what about our darling Bridget and her rude awakening? Let's just hear a little of her reaction soon after Dougal left for work on that Tuesday morning. It will show you what kind of mindset Bridget was in. By the time her husband left for work on Tuesday morning, Bridget was at exhaustion point and totally overwhelmed by the past 3 days. Immediately after seeing him off at the back door, she filled an enamel dish with water as hot as she could stand and carried it to her bedroom, where she modestly bathed her bruised and tender parts. Bridget was trying hard, but she was finding it very difficult to equate marital sex with the blessed sacrament of marriage. She could not help it, she just felt violated. How could it be that once the wedding vows had been exchanged, what used to be so sinful is suddenly lawful and acceptable in the eyes of both God and His church? After remaking the bed with clean sheets, Bridget stood for a long time looking at the room that represented her new life. She then moved to the front room where the image of the Sacred Heart looked down on her lovingly from above the fireplace. She was suddenly overwhelmed by feelings of longing and despair for the chaste and contemplative life she had left behind, and felt fear and apprehension for what lay ahead as the wife of an experienced and lusty hot-blooded male. Now, even though the first pages of this book open in 1949 and end 12 months later in 1950, in no way is the subject matter linear. Instead, it circumambulates the individual characters and their stories. And we really can't know how Bridget arrived at her decision in the final pages without looking back to where she came from. That is, before the opening on page 1, and more importantly, before she came under the influence of Father O'Doherty, the character who represented soul-destroying indoctrination. And here we see Bridget leaving home for the first time, the age 14. So that's the age when most young women of Bridget's station in life left home and entered domestic service in the homes of her betters. I think it's important for us to go even further back and take a look into who Bridget was prior to her leaving home and coming under Father O'Doherty's strict, mind-bending Catholic dogma for the next 7 years of her life. And why I say this is because, as we all know, it's during those formative years that who we have become hinges on who we were. As wisely put by many intuitive people of the ages, in order to know oneself, one must look to the past, because who we were in the beginning is who we are now. During Bridget's formative years, her soul was well nurtured. Together, she and her grandmother traipsed the hills and creek edges, sourcing indigenous plants and wild herbs and rose hips, only to then spend hours sitting in her grandmother's kitchen, listening to tales and helping grind, stir, and prepare ointments and potions that her grandmother later sold to the farmers and townfolk. Bridget's grandmother was of Irish gypsy descent and known far and wide as a healer and wise woman, a knowledgeable woman who spoke words and made potions that were said to heal both man and beast, a soulful woman. She understood the dreams, tea leaves, runes, and the cards were tools or instruments of intuition and to be used to the facilitation of inner knowledge. Like the symbols engraved on stones, for instance, they were nothing more than a mirror, simply there to reflect and reveal our inner self. Now, according to her grandmother, Bridget also possessed the gift, but as we will see, 7 years under Father O'Doherty's influence, any giftedness was sent deep underground. The question is, can and will these God-given gifts of Bridget's ever see the light of day again? Well, let's go back to the day Bridget left home. There she is, about to leave her cloistered world, a place where dreams were attended to and one's soul was nurtured. Before leaving the cottage, Bridget's grandmother did a last-minute check of the contents of her bag, which, as well as containing a few personal possessions, also included 3 chief exercise books. Her grandmother said that they were there for her to record her nightly dreams. Now, Hinnie, so as not to neglect your morning duties, it's important that you rise early enough so as to attend to your dreams. And Bridget, holding up the exercise books, replied, I will, Granny, I promise. And I'll make sure to bring them home with me on my days off. So, talk about myself now. My formative years were a bit like young Bridget's. My mother was a spiritual woman, an ex-contemplative nun. She rarely sprouted dogma, but more about God's love. God is good was her mantra. And although I don't think she'd ever heard of Carl Jung, she instinctively understood inner knowing and the oneness of God. She was certainly a bit psychic and possessed a beautiful spirituality. And despite the heavy indoctrination I received after starting school, for those first 5 years, my soul was nurtured, and I was in the realm of being myself. I had a voice. I felt close to nature, and thanks to my mother, I think I've always known the difference between spirituality and religion. For both Bridget and myself, the spirituality of our formative years had nothing to do with dogma and everything to do with our state of consciousness. So here we have Father O'Doherty processing into the church and young Bridget following. So after 7 years under Father O'Doherty's influence for Bridget and 10 years of Catholic school for me, the influences of our early childhood had worn thin, and we no longer trusted our innate senses and hardly recognised our God within. Speaking for myself, I know that much of my inner knowing had gone underground and was buried. Roll on to my 20s, mid-20s, married with 2 children, and I was in despair. I had no idea who I was. I had well and truly lost sight of my authentic self. In fact, I can clearly remember crying in despair as my darling, bewildered husband attempted to answer my imploring questions as to my identity. "Who am I would cry, and eagerly remember his unsatisfactory replies of something like, "You're my darling, you're my wife." And me sobbing in reply, "I know I'm your wife, and I know I'm Kathy and Michael's mother, but who am I?" Bridget's 7 years of indoctrination by Father O'Doherty nearly destroyed her sense of self too. The one thing that saved her during this time was that she remained receptive to her dreams, something she was able to justify because attending to one's dreams was biblical and they contained divine messages. Then after she entered the contemplative order of the Benedictine nuns, the Mother Superior actively encouraged the practice, and in fact, she introduced her to the writings of Hildegard von Bingen, the 11th century mystic. It was only then that Bridget realised the reason why she chose that order was because she had always been attracted to mysticism. So much of Hildegard's words and wisdom echoed that of her beloved grandmother, knowing she had long tried to suppress, but not forgotten, no matter how hard she had tried over the years. It was all still there, just simmering in the unconscious and giving her some degree of balance. Not all was lost. There was still a chance for her to find her authentic self. Somehow, she had to rekindle the gifts of the Spirit, particularly in the area of discernment and her intuition. So here, these three represent 3 Westlake cottages. Number 65 was the one in the middle where Bridget lived. Number 64 where Gwyn lived, and 66 Annie. Okay, so now that we have an idea of where both Bridget and I came from, let's get on with the plot of the drama, which is an attempt to facilitate Bridget's return to her true self. It is concerned with reconciling 2 parts of the psyche, or a spiritual death and rebirth, and essentially aimed at demonstrating how, despite her soul being nurtured for 14 years in the kind of idyllic environment that would enable her to blossom into wholeness, when 7 years of heavy indoctrination into mind-dominated Catholic religion followed those years, it looked as though Bridget's authentic self might be lost forever. And so, here we see Bridget nestled into number 65. On her right lived Annie Reardon, a highly intuitive woman and granddaughter of an Irish wise woman. Through community and relationships, Annie encouraged other women to use their intelligence and wisdom in a way that would best benefit from their own innate sound advice that comes from the gut, as opposed to the kind of knowing that one might source from the brain. Annie is an enabler, and the playing cards and her tea leaves are simply tools, a bit like peepholes that she uses to help and enable the women to take a deep look within themselves. No magic involved, She just used tools to help her clients learn to read the subtle signs, to join the dots, to find their own truth and get in touch with what they already knew, something Bridget once had but had buried and needs Annie's help to dig up again. One of Annie's clients was a lady named Gabrielle Ryan, who when she first met Annie was under the belief that you make your bed, you lie on it, something that had been drilled into her by her strict Catholic upbringing. So her initial expectations of Annie was that she would give her the strength to endure her miserable existence. I'll read you a couple of snippets in Gabrielle's own words. I had learned so much about myself and I can't explain how it happened. It certainly hasn't been from anything Annie has said. All I can say is that I have learned to know my own truth from the dregs of Annie's teacups, and it has made me strong. Almost in tears, she continued, you know, Bridget, I would never ever have the opportunity to find out about myself if it hadn't been for Annie Reardon. It was only through her that I came to realise that I am so much more than the sum total of a turn-the-cheek Catholic wife and mother. And over to the left, we have Gwyn. Gwyn Smart, a woman who introduces Bridget to the works of Carl Jung. Gwyn would best be described as a seeker, an avid reader, and a woman comfortable with her animus. She's spiritual, but not particularly religious. A constant and steadfast woman with good instincts and an inquiring mind. Unlike Annie, Gwyn operates more out of the external stimuli, books and other people's experiences. A discerning woman, Gwyn pays attention to what is going on in the external world and notes how it makes her feel and uses these observations to inform her of the truth. This element of discernment is a form of personal power that Bridget will need as she journeys towards wholeness. It is through Gwyn's brother Dylan that Bridget first hears about Jung. Dylan is an avid reader and letter writer who has always sent snippets of what he has read in his letters to his sister Gwyn. So when he started mentioning Jung's interest in dreams and knowing that Bridget attended to her dreams, Gwyn began sharing snippets of her brother's letters with her, like this. Dylan has been reading about a Dr. Jung who has ideas about what dreams mean. Bridget would like to have heard a little more about what this doctor referred to as the unconscious mind, because from what she could work out, Dr. Jung believed both dreams and symbols are all part of it. And she also felt in many ways things that Jung referred to was not so different to that of her grandmother and of Hildegard of Bingen in their references to the oneness of soul. I knew you'd be interested, said Gwyn. I remember a while ago you saying something about the symbolic aspect of dreams and where you thought they came from. Another time when Bridget was concerned about her little stepson's reoccurring nightmares, she thought it no coincidence that in Dylan's next letter, he wrote about Dr. Jung's belief that there is a definite connection between our ancestors' experiences and our dreams. Leaving Bridget and the wise neighbours aside for a moment, I, at around the same age of Bridget, was at the bottom rung of self-discovering myself. You remember that as a young wife and mother, I cried, I know I'm your wife and Kathy and Michael's mother. But who am I? It must have been a few years later when I embarked on a bit of adult faith education. I was hoping it might give me a better perspective, but I think it only made me more confused. It certainly increased my sense of guilt. The fact that I'd had my tubes tied around that time wouldn't have helped much either. I'd fluctuate between, this is a matter between me and my God, and I haven't done anything wrong so long as my conscience is clear. Well then, why was I so racked with fear and guilt? A short time after that, my husband and I attended a communication and facilitation course ran by the ACT Health. The aim of the course was to give people the skills needed to run groups in the community. This was a very good course. In fact, it became the start of me facilitating many different types of groups, including college groups on relationships and marriage, engaged couples on communication, and finally support groups for carers of people with dementia. But as you all know, one cannot succeed at any kind of group counselling or facilitation until one is first prepared to take a good long look at oneself. And thus it came to pass that community communication course became the catalyst of my journey into self-discovery. You know how it goes. After each presentation by the leader, the participants are invited to break up into small groups and give their personal reaction to what has been shared. Well, I would have joined in and had quite a bit to say for myself, but there wouldn't have been one authentic thought amongst anything I shared with the group. I clearly remember the facilitator looking quizzically at me and saying something to the tune of, I just can't quite figure out where you're coming from. And the fact of the matter was, neither did I. At the time, I couldn't have sprouted an original thought to save myself. There wasn't one word of myself in anything I said. I was sprouting a collective me, an identity formed by my religion, race, class, and political alliances. It was ego-charged thinking, or mind-made self. The facilitator's words have never left me, and they turned out to be that pivotal moment in my life and the turning point, the beginning of my search for self. And so from then onwards, I was on a pilgrimage. And although at the time, on a conscious level, I didn't understand what was happening to me, somewhere deep inside, I knew that if I was prepared to do the hard yards, that with a good bit of digging and prodding, the preschooler Eve, the one who had her self stolen by going to school and being subjected to head-orientated dogma, could and would be resurrected. A huge step in the right direction occurred when in my 40s I encountered Carl Jung. I can remember the quickenings, those déjà vu moments when the experience of thinking that a new situation had occurred before. I would read or hear something and think, yes, I know that. And it was as if I'd always known it, but only just become aware of it. Then, when studying the mystics, like Hildegard von Bingen, 13th century Julian of Norwich, 14th century Joan of Arc, 15th century John of the Cross, and in our own time, that of Thomas Merton, the one that made the most impact on me was Hildegard. For me, encountering Jung, followed by Hildegard, caused me to realise that nothing is new. Neither Jung nor Hildegard were coming up with new discoveries or inventing things of the soul. And I came to understand that all wisdom is ancient and has been in the collective unconscious for always. Roll on until 5 years ago, when I set aside numerous different versions of this novel and began to write in earnest. This time around, it was as if I had my own muse, dictating words and directing my every move. And throughout the process, as the sentences turned into pages and the pages into chapters, for both Bridget and myself, a spiritual death and rebirth occurred. It only took 40 years for me to come to the realisation that the voice in my head is not who I am. Me examining my conscience, seeking out things that possibly could keep me out of heaven, a set of thoughts associated with the dogma of my Catholic faith and belief systems that had nothing to do with who I am. I also came to the realisation that this heaven I strove for was not a location, but the inner realm of consciousness. The self-love I have gained through writing A Dream in a Teacup is the unconditional love that comes from either the divine or from self. A self-love is powerful, the kind of love that is found in the deepest essence of the soul, a place where we are kind to ourselves, where love seeks only to open our eyes so we can see exactly who we are. At this stage, I just want to briefly go back to my characters, of which I had many, too many, according to the opinion of a couple of good friend readers during the early stages of editing. And I'm sure in general, one should limit the number of characters involved. But in relation to A Dream in a Teacup, all the characters depicted aspects of myself that needed to be brought to the fore. Some of my characters I would liken to travelling companions, sometimes aware of them, but always at the edge of my conscious mind and just out of reach. Some, I believe, were shadow personifications. An example of this is Rosa Camanzuli. She pushed her way into the story 2/3 of the way through, and pushy she was. Like all my characters, she had her individual story demanding to be told. I didn't always realise it, but Rosa was probably a personification of one of my shadows, an aspect of my self-consciousness, an aspect of my ego consciousness, and a facet of myself that maybe I had problems in acknowledging. Jung would say that shadow acts in a compensatory way, giving balance, and although negative, has a lot of positive traits to offer. This is a character. There is a character in this story named Ellen, who sees Rosa as a threat. Ellen believes Rosa wants to steal her life away from her. And how does this relate to me? Well, I actually had a dream that I was in the water with a baby and we were both about to drown. At the same time, there was a Rosa figure standing on the shore holding the same baby. In an instant, I knew this woman wanted my life for herself. And upon that realisation, somehow, the baby and I were transported to the shore, and at the same instant, the Rosa in my dream took my place and was drowned. Fast forward to the final chapter, where it becomes evident that Bridget has come to the conclusion that her grandmother's pagan spirituality and her Christian faith are compatible. Not unlike Jung, who in his later years acknowledged his soul was finally Christian and not European pagan. Like Jung, Bridget comes to the conclusion that religion is still a live option for modern humans. Even after they have analysed the transference and outgrown the need for a parent in heaven, they both essentially return to wholeness in Christianity. Again. Have a couple of rooms. Anyone sitting? That's fabulous. It gave us a lot to think about.
Can you sit on the chair, Eve? Is that all right?
Sit here.
Up here.
Has anyone got any questions or any thoughts on, or yes, Mary?
Eve, so you mentioned finding yourself, like, who am I? You know, and that's a very powerful question, because it takes us a lifetime to find out who's I. And I was interested that you mentioned your Catholic schooling, and later on you studied at the Catholic University here. Did any of that help you in answering a question, who am I, finding your spiritual self? Or should I ask, where along the line in life did you start finding bits of your spiritual self? Right?
No, you don't need it for us, but it's helpful.
On the Zoom, you need it on the Zoom.
I think probably initially, I think the catalyst was when I heard about Carl Jung. I think there was just so much of what he was saying that as I said in this talk, it was like, yes, I know that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was hearing the me, you know, and so that, but then when I went to Catholic University and to do my master's, and we were studying the different mystics again, I think something happened there. But it wasn't really until I started to really get seriously and write and get stuck into the book. That's I don't know what happened then. I'd just get up early in the morning and I'd put on some nice classical music and I'd start to write, and I'd be writing nonsense, you know, not nonsense, but just anything. And then something would happen. It was like a muse took over and told me what to write. And from then onwards, it was just listening. And somewhere in the writing of the book, that's how I found me.
So reading about Carl Jung and his...
That was what started. I think
it was like a homecoming for you.
Yeah, it was like,
this is me, this is where I belong.
I know that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I've had similar experiences.
Eva, thank you so much. Absolutely exciting and fascinating. I'd love to know whether you've got any inclination to make it into a play, because it does sound like it could make an outstanding theatre production.
Yes, well, a few people have... Pardon? I'd love to get Nicole Kidman to read it. Does anyone know how to get a book to Nicole? Yes, no, I just quite a few people have said to me, oh, you know, there's a lot of dialogue in it. And a few people have said, quite a few people have said to me, you know, this would make a really good play. But yeah, who knows? Yes, she does.
Nicole is in the Southern Highlands. She's Australia grounded. I'm sure that you could contact her through her agent in Sydney. but the thing is, you need to have a script first. That's all.
Yeah. But
So-
I would just like her and her mother actually, because her mother is the right age group of Catholic upbringing, and she would understand. She would get it. She would get this book, and I'd love to get a copy to her mother, but I don't know how to get a postal address. Yeah. Yes, in Sutton Forest. Yeah.
It's on Golden Vale Road. We just live across the road from there, and you could just put it
She
through
lives
the
in
gate.
Australia. They're living up at Byron at the moment.
Oh, okay.
Because they're making that
Right.
what's that movie? You know, book that we love. Strangers. 12 Strangers. They're making that up there in Byron Bay at the moment.
You just go over.
Sorry.
You go turn left. It's Golden Vale Road. Over the bridge. On the left, there's some gates. That's it. The gates.
I could go and pop it in their letterbox. Yeah. Well, that's all you got to do is just get it to someone. Yeah.
Eve, thank you very much for your talk, and your book sounds fascinating in terms of your experience growing up as a Catholic in Australia. And I found it really interesting how you set your Catholic indoctrination in the context of the sort of liberation that you experienced from discovering Carl Jung's approach. And Jung had a sympathy for the Catholic Church in terms of its grasp of archetypal symbolic imagery. But I think that Father O'Doherty probably didn't appreciate that sort of understanding of the Catholic symbolism. Like often the church itself is incredibly dogmatic and literal. So like the ideas that you were taught as a child about heaven and hell were they were inculcated for you as literal truth. And I think one of the things from psychology is how traumatic that process can be. Like as you come to terms with, how does this make sense? Can I understand it in some sort of symbolic way, or do I actually have to accept the sort of traditional literal dogma? So those are the thoughts that came to me while you were talking, and I'd just be interested in your reflections on those issues.
Yeah. Well, in the book, there's a little girl called Heather, and she's very, very religious, very, very devoted to the Virgin Mary, and so she goes to St Christopher's at Monica, and quite often she gets permission to go across to the church at lunchtime to make a visit to the Virgin Mary. And so she kneels down right up the front in front of the statue, and she has these conversations with Mary. And so she tells Mary all her concerns and worries, worried that her daddy's not going to Mass and that he'll be going to hell, and so you get to see what you were talking about, this this child being heavily indoctrinated and the terrible fear. But then you also see that through her Catholicism, she's got this beautiful relationship with Mary, which is really part of her, and she really mothers her. So there's, as you say, there's. And what was your name? Your name? Terry. Yeah, Terry was. We were talking at the break. The difference between like the heavily indoctrinated part of the church, but also the beautiful symbolism and because it's all there. All that beautiful symbolism is all there, but it just got put down by, you know, with the literalism, wasn't it, you know? Yeah. No. I think everybody's searching, aren't they? I mean, we're all searching, and if you don't find it in the church, you'll find it somewhere else, won't you? And that is the problem. But I mean, the last thing I would have ever wanted was my children to be indoctrinated. I can remember when it was Kathy was in about 5th or 6th grade and at Catholic school. And I can't remember how it came up, but I remember saying to this nun, I said, look, to be honest, I couldn't care less if Kathy doesn't even know where Rome is, so long as she knows that God loves her. And that, you know, and I don't know how it went over, but, you know, I didn't want my children heavily indoctrinated. I don't know whether you have felt heavily indoctrinated, but... Yeah. So I think you got a much better education.
And it's, if I can just, one more, it's the open mind. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. And he migrated or emigrated to Indonesia. And our family's history is all there. But he was fascinated with the Jewish, with the Islamic faith and all this. And he befriended them. He learned Arabic so he could read the Quran. And so he was open to the fact there are many paths to God. When he returned to Holland for retirement, he went to a church once, his particular church, and he found that so bigoted, so close-minded, that he never went again. So there you are. That's a danger of going somewhere where it's more liberal, or where you can be liberal and returning that. And the same with Mary and I, when we got married, we shopped around. The truth. Yes, and we came to, I think it was Archdeacon Hill in St. John's, and he was wonderful. When we came back from our honeymoon, there was another young fella there who'd been to America, and we couldn't identify with him at all. So it was the person and the message that we attuned to. It wasn't a dogma, as you just described.
You know, he's like a salesman, very forceful, and yeah, we don't want that. It didn't touch us. Okay.
Eve, thank you for that wonderful talk. I wonder if you could comment about you're becoming your own inner analyst?
I think that's the hypothesis I put out for this. You know, is it possible that through the process of writing that you could become your own analyst? And I mean, I can't prove it, but I just know that through the writing of this book, something changed in me. I lost those fears and anxieties. I'm very, very comfortable with who I am now. And that's all happened, I believe, through the process of writing this. Yep.
Did that awareness come quickly to you, or did
No,
it slow
no,
out?
it just happened.
Years.
Well, I think, you know, probably when 5.5 years ago, my husband was diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer, and it was at the same time that I'd gone to Sydney to the New South Wales. He came with me to the New South Wales Writers Group, and I'd taken the first 3 chapters of my old manuscript. Well, I'd posted it down, and then for $150, this professional editor would read it and then give you an hour's feedback. And so and it was the same week that Brian had been diagnosed. And so I had this feedback, and I don't know what she said to me, really. I mean, she wrote a few notes on the things, but from what I heard was go home and start from scratch, you know. And so from that day onwards, I went home, I put all that stuff aside and started again. And I had the name then, which I didn't have before. I was calling it something else. And it was just like, I mean, it wasn't easy. It took several years. But it just, as I say, it was as if I had this muse telling me, and I just have to listen. And then I'd think, no, Bridget wouldn't say that. She'd say it this way. So it happened gradually. And by the time, and my husband died about 16 months, 14 months after that, 16 months. And I would never have been able to deal with his illness and then the grieving, and if it hadn't been for the writing of the book. I'd get up at 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the morning, and I'd be at the computer. Otherwise, I would have just stayed in bed all day, I think. If so, it definitely was my therapy.
A friend of ours lost his daughter in childbirth, and then shortly after his wife.
Oh.
Both of them. And he was in such a state of grief and loss that in a fairly short time he took to writing poetry. Very poetry about the desolation, the anger, you know, all this fear and frustration, losing someone, particularly when it's sort of premature like that. And it became such an obsession. He's written 20 books of poetry.
Yep.
And he's now aged 99.
99.
And you know, he's still writing. He's 29 years.
But maybe you have to have some kind of grief or something to get you in touch with, you know.
We're creating a website for him, you know, for all the rest of it. He does sell his books ongoing, but he's inspired that purpose of talking about having and certainly that's what applies in this case. Just marvellous. You know, whether you like his poetry or not is almost irrelevant. I think it is what he's saying there. But many people do it.
Yeah.
And particularly his sense of purpose. Yes, I had to spend a day while reading with various poetry readings.
So he's a returned soldier.
No, but he writes about modern things. I had Michael Thwaites, some of the people here might know him. He was a poet of some renown, poets and so forth. People of that ilk were reading. Anyway, our friend came up for that, and it was very well received. And it's put him in touch with other people, like it's not just for sitting there with your looking at the screen, but interacting with other people, getting a response, making contacts and so forth.
Eve, I want to follow up further on this issue of the Catholic Church, because as an institution, it's in a bit of a mess. And I'm interested in your views and perhaps Terry's views as well, if he'd be interested to share with us on how this tension between the literal statement of faith and its inner symbolic meaning is reflected in the institution and acknowledged in the institution. Like it seems that Pope Francis is trying to encourage a less hidebound sort of mentality within the church, but there's that's not universally accepted.
One of the things that impressed Carl Jung greatly was the declaration in 1950 that Mary, the Mother of God, was assumed bodily into heaven. Yes. And he said the church didn't quite realize what it was doing because he called that the greatest event, religious event since the Reformation. And what he meant by that was that the church, though it didn't know it, was acknowledging the presence of the matter and feminine in God, so, broadening the sense of what God meant. So in a way, Catholicism fools itself, and it's got deep down this capacity for understanding the symbolism of the things that that it does. So I have a little bit of trust, if you like, that process will continue to work. And I agree with Robert that Francis likes to tap into what he calls the common person's faith, and so he encourages what we might think are like superstitious practices, and yet they're founded on a deep sense of what the symbolism of them is. So there's hope for us, I think, in that.
What was I going to say? In Joseph Campbell's book, there is a phrase, where you stumble, that's where your treasure is, you know. In other words, you've got to go through hellfire to find your answer. But in terms of you writing a book, I found that my mother left a lot of notes. She died at 102 years of age 3 years ago. And it informed me about my past. And I thought I owe that to my one and only son. So I've been writing for the past few years. And as you write, you automatically, what you wrote in your book to what you refer to in your book, you analyze, you rediscover, you reappraise, and the things that, say, your parents have done to you, which are bad, you look at it from a more perspective, a different perspective. So you're rewinding life and seeing, what would you call it, the pattern, maybe. Maybe it's a pattern, maybe it's a better understanding of where people come from. And apart from, therefore, facts and figures and so on, it's the analysis. That's the important stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so for me, it's been incredibly useful, because leaving photos behind is all very well, but they don't say all that much. And writing is, yeah. Anyway, it's been excellent for me. I thought it was for my son, but of course it's for me.
Well, that's right. It's your therapy. Yeah.
It's my therapy. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yes. Trying to think. When I was a child at Catholic school, and I think I just mentioned that to Terry, that, you know, okay, we were given the Green Catechism and all that. We had to learn them off by rote. We didn't even understand what they meant. And it was all head stuff. But then there was other things, you know, like once a month you went over to the church for benediction. And I just loved benediction, because it's so symbolic, and there's incense, there's bells ringing, it's so easy to feel feel God. And so I think the church has sort of thrown away the baby with the bathwater. You know, they become very clinical these days, you know, and it's just, you know, you've got to do the church readings exactly right, and there's certain rules here, but they've sort of got rid of a lot of the symbolism stuff, you know. I mean, they don't even have like all the lovely pictures around the walls, or the, you know, things like benediction. And see, I miss the Latin. I miss the Latin Mass. There's something beautiful about, you know, you can get lost in your own thoughts, you know, while everybody's speaking Latin, you know what I mean? We don't understand the words, but you understand it. And it's just sort of something just then to the other thing. Well, yeah, I remember as a child at school, after lunch, we'd have the rosary. And again, you know, you Hail Mary, full of grace, Hail Mary, full of grace, Hail Mary, full of grace. And, you know, 5 decades of the rosary said, and you wouldn't think, what happened? But while that's going on, you were relaxing and really learning first lessons in meditation, really. And that's all gone.
Sorry, I found a lot of my Catholic faith back after joining Siddha meditation, Siddha yoga, I should say. And they talked about it, you know, centering on the self, and I didn't get it at all. But it's listening to the soul within, the spirit within. And then I went with my mother to a Catholic church here in Macquarie somewhere. And and the priest was talking about God dwelling within your heart. And I thought, yeah, that's where I found it initially, but it was my spirit. I didn't feel comfortable with calling it God or the self. That doesn't mean anything to me. But the spirit, I found my own spirit. And when I did that, I accidentally became very clairvoyant. And then I was teaching other people, because when you experience your soul as opposed to experiencing your emotion or your mental activity or your body, your physical body, it's an automatic thing, or it was for me, to see the souls of others, whether they were carnate or incarnate. It was often difficult for me to differentiate when I had images of other people who weren't in the room. And it was often the way they were dressed or the language they used. And I thought, oh, this person has passed. We don't talk like that anymore, you know. And so it became more then an awakening of many things, and then I didn't know what to do with it. It's sort of, you experience your own soul, and in all religion, in all Christianity, you learn that the Spirit of God dwells within, and your soul is eternal. It lives on forever, but it's with us now, and none of us are taught to experience our soul now, to live in our spiritual body. And maybe that's something I'd like to talk about in the new year here at the Jungian Society. Would you like that? Yeah, okay. How I found my own spirit and I accidentally became a medium and all these sort of things. I don't do any of that anymore because I feel I've done my share of it. But it was a very strange experience. Okay, anybody?
Yeah, one of the things that we, from a Calvinist or Wesleyan tradition, sometimes feel regretful at is the loss of the mystery and magic of the Catholic Church.
The mysteries.
Which we can even see with the high Anglicans and so forth. You know, the Latin, the ridiculous sculptures. I'm sorry, the beautiful sculptures and things, and the
Michelangelo.
Yes, and the you know, the incense and the robes and all that, and we go for something that's much more down to earth, as it were. But there is something missing in that mystery and magic, isn't it? Yeah. I was travelling with our lovely son in Argentina when he was about 20, and we were walking around and travelling by bus and so forth, and we happened in a little village upon a village like Queanbeyan, like Bungendore, I should say, but they all have cathedrals in them, enormous stone churches, you know, some of them from the Jesuits and 400 years ago and so forth. And every day at 5 p.m. they have the mass, and we sneaked in and sat in the back where we wouldn't attract any attention or be required to do anything, you know, and it was extraordinary. People who we might carefully call peasant type people, you know, agricultural type people, not academics or by any means, but they had it was a mystery of Latin and Spanish. So we didn't understand a real lot of what was going on, but you pick up odd words, you know. And for them, it was just marvellous. Obviously, a very central part of their daily life, to be there at 5 p.m. for the Mass.
5 p.m. and then probably at midday there was the Angelus.
Yes.
The bells would ring at midday.
Yes.
And everybody, people in the fields, wouldn't they? You know, they'd kneel down and say their Angelus. There's something beautiful about it.
Yeah.
Kerry wants to say.
I'll just to continue. So one of the problems of the modern world is that we say only what we can understand and describe is real and meaningful. But you're saying in your life there is so much that is real that is in symbolism, in ritual, in tradition, but at the same time that those traditions can become quite constricting. So there's a tension there.
Yeah.
Just a little bit about being your own director, your own spiritual director, and which is a bit like listening to what your soul is saying to you. One of the great influences on Carl Jung was Meister Eckhart, and Meister Eckhart is 13th, 14th century Dominican, and the thing that he learnt from Eckhart was that the soul mattered. And Jung wrote that he spent a lot of time studying the soul and trying to work out what it is until he finally learnt from Meister Eckhart that the soul wasn't something that you studied, it's something that you had a relationship with. And so he he then spent a lot of time on developing this relationship with the soul. Wasn't quite the same as Philemon, but it's pretty close to it. Some sort of inner reality that he could converse with. And he endorsed the use of things like runes and tea leaves, but he particularly endorsed the tarot cards. Anyway, I have to say from my own experience, they're a very powerful personal spiritual director. I wondered whether, I remember you talking about the old grandmother who spoke about the cards. And so what would you say about using the cards, but in particular the cards as a form of personal spiritual direction?
Well, I haven't had a lot of experience with the tarot cards. I don't think I even knew what they were until probably 30, 40 years ago. Certainly not growing up, I wasn't familiar with them. But there was certainly in my neighbourhood, there was one particular lady who I've sort of used Annie Reardon as part of, who read the tea leaves. And people from all over Canberra would come to her for advice. And then there was another lady I know that used to just ordinary playing cards. And again, so that would be very similar to the tarot cards, although the tarot cards are very specific, aren't they? They're much more symbolic. They've got much more. I'd like to actually know a bit more about them. Yeah, I love the runes. Yeah, I've got 2 sets of rune stones. Yeah, well, because they're each a symbol, aren't they? And, yeah, and so in the book, Bridget reads Annie's rune stones because she had them, but she didn't know how to use them, and Annie would read the tea leaves for Bridget. That's all.
I tried reading, well, I still have a set of tarot cards. I had 3 different packs because they express themselves differently. And for me, it was just a detour because I had to sort of analyze the symbols in that and work up from that. And I just found palm reading, you're touching the person, and there was a faster link into that person. Like, and when I was I went backpacking on my own when I was 60 or 61 and around Europe. And I took very, very ill in hospital, and my sister in Tasmania wanted to fly over and come and look after me. And I said, no, my palm says that I'll live till 88. So this is not going to, Mary, this is serious. You're very ill. You know that. I said, yes, I don't feel too good at all, but this is not going to kill me.
I'm going to be all right.
Yeah, it's not going to kill me. And now, ever since I've had a few patch-up jobs, I now reckon I'll live till 92, so I'm not going anywhere soon. So, but I've found tarot cards if people need them to link in. But for me, it was a detour. Just linking directly with that person's spirit was faster and easier for me.
Absolutely anything.
Yeah, teacups.
But in the tea leaves, I don't know whether you've ever looked at the. Well, you've got to go and buy the right tea leaves these days, which is a bit hard because everything's in a tea bag. But you know the concept is, you know, that when the tea is empty, you sort of turn the cup over onto the saucer and bring it back, and then you look into the cup, and there are patterns, and there are definite patterns, and you have to look, but there are real symbol and signs there.
6 weeks. Or if they drew a house with 2 windows, she knew they only had 2 weeks to go before their soul would take. So somewhere from within that young spirit, there was already a message automatically coming out. They were predicting their own.
Can be anything, yeah.
Yeah, so interpreting drawings, and there are also a group of psychologists who ask kids to put a few blobs of ink or paint on paper and then fold it in half, and then ask them what they see in the picture that comes out, what they see in it intuitively, and that helps to analyze the soul. So what comes from within, like when I've had people doing exercises, imaginative exercises, and they said, well, I saw my father or my mother or whatever who's passed over. And they said, well, I was probably imagining it. And I said, well, where does imagination come from? It comes from within you. So what part of you does it come from? It's not something you've learned in the brain. It's not in your brain. It's somewhere.
It's not head stuff, no.
It comes from within you. So imagination is like Carl Jung talks about dreams that are highly imaginative and symbolic, but it comes from within us. So it has a message for us.
Yeah, I think sort of an example of, you know, as you're saying, drawings and things like that. I remember quite a few years ago when I worked for ACT Health, I was involved in some art therapy, and I was asked to join with somebody else, and we were going to run a one-day thing for children with diabetes. And so part of it was we're going to, my role was to have them in this room and have them draw something. And then we had this social worker who was going to have a look at them and so forth. But the interesting thing was, so what I asked, I talked to them, they were children from, you know, say 7 or up to about 14 or 15. And so I talked to them about trees and how many different trees there are. And if they could imagine themselves as a tree, what sort of tree would they be? And ask them to draw the tree, draw themselves their tree. And it was really, really interesting that when it was all over and we went around having a look, there was 3 boys. They were very prickly boys, you know. Well, they would because they've recently had diabetes diagnosed. And 3 of them, they were sitting in different places, had drawn a cactus. Very, very interesting. One was a bit big and one was a small. But there was 3 amongst, there was only about probably 15 children in this room, or maybe 20, but there was 3 cactuses. It's interesting. But they were very prickly boys, you know. They didn't want to be there, and you know. But when they got into it, yeah.
Before Madam Chair kicks us out, could I ask a couple of personal questions? One is actually to Diana. Could we have just a word for you about your experience of your mum's enormous enterprise here over a long time? So we know what was going on.
With the book writing, or? Well, she's always been amazing and really intuitive and taught us to listen to that self and inner self, I think. Well, for me particularly, she was saying in the kitchen that I probably got the best mum out of my 3 siblings because she was that bit more mature and wise by the time I've got her. But my mum, I don't know if you know, she had a 60th all-women's croning ceremony for her birthday. So she's been into this stuff for a long time. She's acting like she's only just got to know herself, but I think she's, I mean, in a way, and dealt with your grief definitely for losing Dad through the book, but I think you've had a very strong sense of yourself deep down that you've shared with your children. I don't know if that's at all answering your question, but seeing her write the book was incredible. And she was a bit possessed, like they talk about the spirit of the writing got in her, and she had her, wasn't such a struggle to get the characters out, but was, I think my dad and I found it a bit more stressful than she did.
Our poor dad wasn't of this type of thinking. He was a very literal man.
Did you become motivated to do some writing yourself? Or did you pause
My work is writing, so I've lost my creative spark, I feel a bit, but I hope when I've got time and to reflect and find my story, but yeah, I definitely have a couple of books in. Just have the time to get it out.
You used to write some really good stories when you were in high school and college.
Yeah. When you start doing it as a job and editing, it becomes a lot harder.
I was going to say, did you become motivated to do some writing, or the opposite? Did you see what was happening with your mum and say, well, I don't
a little bit, yeah. I think the main thing that most of my friends and mum's friends, it's mum's bravery to do it, because so many people think they've got a book, but they're like, oh, I can't write. I couldn't, you read books and you don't think you can do it. But the best thing about mum is she just did it. But just do it, I think.
Well, I could never, ever have done it if I didn't have lots and lots of help from wonderful literate friends. I mean, I think I am a bit dyslexic, and I can't spell, I can't do punctuation, I can't do any of those things. But I've got lovely friends like Francis and people like that who will look at my work and edit it. And I could never have done it with the help of a lot of friends.
And they all say about mum that they could never come up with the stories and the tales, because that's what I think mum is, a storyteller.
Thank you, Mary.
And my other question, if I may, is where does it leave you, Eve? Do you feel any sort of sense of anticlimax? I mean, once the book's published, you can't go back and meddle with it very much, can you?
I did after the book launch. I went a bit flat for a while, because it's all this build up for so long, and I did feel a bit flat. But I want to do some more writing. I've so many people that have read the book say to me, oh, you've got to do a sequel, you've got to do a sequel. We want to know what happened to Little Heather. We want to know what happened to this one. We want to know what happened, And so I've mapped a story out, how it would begin and how it end, but that's as far as I've got. But this year has been a bit of a strange year, hasn't it? And it's just a bit hard to get motivated.
Yes.
But I'll get back into it.
I think we've come to the end of our time with you, Eve. It's just been absolutely amazing. And you brought back an idea, or with my grandmother, she used to read tea leaves, and she used to be very well sought after because she was part Indian, so she had the spirituality and the unusual character to go with reading the tea leaves. So she used to be quite a gem and quite unusual lady, which we learnt a lot from her. And also reflecting when you were talking about the Catholic Church, we were in New York last year for my birthday, and we went to a big Catholic cathedral, and it was full of people. It was just phenomenal experience, and this fellow, I think he might have been a cardinal on his whole outfit, was talking in Latin, speaking in Latin, and quite fast. It was quite amazing, just to listen to this Latin just coming forward. It was just truly amazing. And everyone in this church was absolutely spellbound. They were all going, and it was just truly an amazing experience. You look back on New York now and you think, oh my goodness, what's happened to the place? Whereas when we were there, it was just so amazing to be there, to be in New York and to experience such a thing. And people were coming in the church in droves. People that probably had never even been in a church all came in the door and they were all sort of expressing their absolutely awe at this presence of this priest or this cardinal. I think he might have been pretty special. So that was quite a thing when you brought up these things for me. Yeah. And their memories, amazing memory. And anyway, thank you for such a splendid evening and soul searching for all of us, I think. And we'd like to give you this small token, like a appreciation and a small token for you to go and celebrate doing something special for yourself. Thank you. And a Jung Society has the last event in December the 5th on a Saturday. We're going to have a lunch, probably a later lunch, maybe 12 to 12:30, and then we'll have an afternoon tea, so Eve can come along. Yeah. Oh, we should be there. I hope.